Hello, everybody. Happy Tuesday. Happy Wednesday. Hope you're all doing well, healthy. Yeah. Okay. I got all kinds of questions today. Um, I I hate to keep banging on the volume thing, but I got a couple more questions today regarding volume. And the question is, volume today is a major thing. What increments should a regular guy do? Half a liter or a liter? Okay, I've addressed this a few times, but part of it depends on your age, your weight, your ability. Um, no no regular guy should even worry about a half a liter, because a half a liter is like a small cup of water. It's a half a quart, and you're not going to feel it. The volume is dictated as a percentage of your weight in the metric system, and the bigger the board, the bigger the range you can have in volume. But also, a regular guy, if you're intermediate plus, probably advanced, a liter, like 26 to 27 liters or somewhere in the middle there. Um, a 1 liter range. That's if you're a lighter surfer. You're under 30 liters in volume. But as you get into longer boards, the same, on a big longboard, the same percentage, roughly 5%, is going to be 3 times as much. So it'll be 3 liters. And once again, you have to ask the question: can you feel it? And is it necessarily a bad thing? And as long as I've surfed, I've always had bigger, more massive boards in my quiver. My board's not really short, but my short boards, would be 7.4, 7.6, 7.8, and then sometimes just for laughs, I would get on a bigger board. And even in the days when I had a smaller quiver, I had my regular hot dog board, I had my step-up board, and then I probably had what I call the fun board, where it typically was higher volume, and you learn to draw different lines, you learn to approach the wave differently, and you'll learn, and you'll have fun. You'll probably catch more waves. I've watched surfers in their early stages of their career, or surfers that don't get to surf that long, go out and struggle to catch waves, and they might end up getting 3 waves in an hour, maybe. It's so, think about it in those terms too. Do I want to catch more waves? Well, I probably need more volume, because if I catch more waves, I have more fun, and my skills develop more rapidly. So, regular guy, don't even stress over half a liter. If you're lighter, like 140, 150, 160 pounds, and you're a very good surfer, I'll work within a range of a liter. And as the surfer gets heavier and heavier, and bigger and older, and all that sort of stuff, and the range needs to open up. And in the end, I do 99% custom work these days, and in the end, it's amazing how many people will order boards without any profile, age, weight, size, experience, blah blah blah. And I don't know. I guess they think they want a stock board, and that indicates to me that they probably really haven't worked with a shaper, or stock dimensions look fine. but as as you get older and bigger, give more latitude to me, the shaper. What I'm starting to say is that guys that don't have very much experience are challenging me, and I hate to keep beating my drum, but I've got over 100,000 boards under my belt and 50 years experience. I I might be able to help you, and for instance, I had a customer the other day. We've been going around and around, and he was a little bit bigger, older guy. And first, he wanted a 740 tear. What's it called? What was the old the bigger board that
Yeti?
No, older model, about 20 years old. Terminator. He wanted a Terminator. It's like, guys, I have a handful of old files, but boards have evolved. And so anyways, back to the story. This guy, he wanted a 7.4 Terminator. And then he started thinking, he goes, well, no, I want maybe more volume. So I get a 7.4 Yeti. And then he starts waffling on. He goes, well, I'm going on a trip in a few months. And but I need to duck dive the board. Like, for some people, it's more important to be able to duck dive your board than it is to ride it effectively. How the board performance versus duck diving. That's, believe it or not, I get that. But we, after going around and around and around, we ended up in a 710 Yeti, and this is a guy, it was his first custom board in 20 years. I know it's a big expense, and if you learn to trust your shaper, whoever it is, you'll probably be a lot better off in arguing with the shaper. I had a long-time friend I started making boards for in the mid to late 70s, and he used to come in. He was a builder, and he was a contractor and an architect, and he'd come in with these detailed plans, and every time I'd sit down, I'd go over them with him, and I'd suggest changes, and he would ruminate, and then we get in the shaping room, and over time, he learned it was best just to say, well, I need a 6.5. Do what you want. So, yeah, and that goes back to the thing, different lines. It's, or if you want to go shorter, like a fish or a dwart or something like that, probably should go a few more liters. For the same reason, you catch more waves, you have more fun, you can still ride it 4, 5, 6 inches shorter than your go-to shortboard. What are the basic for outlines? Fuller works on what conditions, narrower on what conditions, and how to find the best outline. That's a great question, because right now everybody's so fixated on volume that they never ask me what about my fin placement, what kind of fin should I get, how about my tail width, how about my nose width, much less rocker and all the other variables. But generally speaking, the wider the board is, the more planing surface it has. And it actually, if you get a 6.2 that is 19.5 and then 20, but they're the same volume, you take a half inch out of the width of a board, and you drop 4 or 6/10 of a liter, and you kind of won't feel that as much as you'll feel the change in width. Narrower boards have a shorter distance from rail to rail. They're quicker. They're more sensitive. Wider boards they plane better. They catch waves easier. They have a slower rail to rail time. But it goes back to what, if you want to change your lines a little bit, and then go for a wider board. Like, typically, I've got the widths down in my brain, but a 160-pound guy might ride 5'10" or 6-footer, and he probably wants an 18.5-inch board. I'm kind of rounding this up, but 180 pounds, add another inch or two, and another 1/4 inch of width, and so forth up the line. But then you have the nose and tail proportions, and the performance hot dog boards have a nose that's typically, they used to be like 2.5 to almost 3 inches narrower than the tail. And I'm talking about a foot back from the nose and a foot up from the tail. So performance shortboards, roughly 2.5. Kind of some models these days are about 2. And then you start to get into alternative boards, and they can not only get wider in the middle, but they get proportionally fuller in the outline. The outline gets a little bit straighter, as you keep the center roughly the same, and you start to grow the ends of the board. And if you ride shorter boards, 4 to 6 inches shorter, you'll have a more parallel outline, and it'll help you draw your turns more out, which is also a combination of the rocker and fin placement. So that's why the fishes have 15.5 to 17-inch wide noses. They're 21 inches wide. They're 5'6", and the tails are 16.5. They basically mimic the nose, and longboards, the noses start, as the boards get longer, the noses become more proportionate. More equal to the tail width. And then as you want to get into more fun boards and longboards and stuff, the noses are started around, 16 seems to be like a cutoff on the nose, 12 inches back. After that, it's starting to look like more like a performance fun board. But longboard noses, on average, are 17 to 18.5 inches wide, and there's some that get wider at 19, 20. And also, I pay attention to the tail width, 18 inches up. Like average performance shortboard is 11 inch. It's about 11 and change at 18 up, and at 12. 6 inches up, sorry. An inch up, performance shortboard, 6.5 inches on average. That's an inch up. 6 inches up, it's 11 and change. 12 inches up, 14.5, maybe 14.75, and so forth up the line. And if you tell me how you want the board to ride, I'll worry about that. But that, just so you understand that there's a lot more than the volume that goes into the board. Lower rocker entry. How does it work? Does it need to be compensated with more tail rocker? ? Rocker is another very important element in the design of your board. Personally, I've always thought that boards have had too much nose rocker, and I feel like if you have your tail rocker right, and on a 6'2", I'd go 4.5, but I go 2 3/8 in the tail, 2 1/4, 2 3/8 in the tail. A lot of other shapers have the noses in the high 4s to pushing the low 5s. And if you think about what rocker is designed to do, it's to put curve in the bottom of your board so you fit the wave. And that's why real hollow dumpy waves, a shorter board doesn't need as much rocker because the lines will fit. But if you're riding a 6'2" and really hollow dumpy waves, you need more rocker. If you're riding kind of average kind of a mushy reef or a high tide beach break or something like that, you don't you don't need as much nose rocker, and you could use a little less tail rocker. And what having a little less nose rocker does helps you board get up and plane a little bit quicker. It helps you catch waves easier. It helps you draw out your turns a little bit more. Whereas a lot of nose rocker will allow you to do very tight turns, but unless you compensate or whatever with a fair bit of tail rocker, you'll be having the front end fight the back end. Like in, I don't know, 1970, Reno Avalera I was just starting to work at GNS, and Reno Avalera did a model one summer called the Disc, and it had really straight tail rocker, but it was like a ski in a sense, where it had a very, very exaggerated nose rocker, and the blanks had to be specially glued up, and when they glassed them, sometimes it put weights on the nose to. Didn't matter as long as it had that look of about a 45-degree bend, and where the nose was really bent up. You could have three boards the same size. You could have one board with low entry and low tail rocker, and that will draw longer turns. You can have a board with low entry and higher tail rocker, and that'll still do tighter turns, but you have to be a little bit more careful coming off the top and when you drop in, that the nose doesn't plow. And then you can have a board with more nose rocker and less tail rocker. And believe it or not, those boards, if they don't have enough tail rocker, if they have plenty of nose rocker, but if they don't have enough tail rocker, they'll still purl, because the wave shape is a tighter curl up at the top, and then it runs down into a flatter curve. And I've kind of based a lot of my shaping thoughts on, I'm sure most shapers have, on the shape of the waves that you're going to be riding on average. So, in 1989, Kelly came onto the scene, and he was working with Al American. The rockers that he was riding, I don't know, he was riding a 6.1 or something, but his nose rocker was like 5 3/4, tail rocker was 2.5. But he was Kelly, and so the world followed Kelly, and for a year or two, the rockers were out of hand. And you'll see these days that surfers have considerably less rocker than they did in the early 90s. But anyways, Glassons versus removable fins. Wow. There was a time when the fin systems first started coming out, and the fin companies were loving it because they could sell more fins, and the fins were so inexpensive to make, and the boxes for that matter. They're all made out of plastic, and they had good-looking templates. They had all kinds of design theory behind them, but the bottom line is the plastic. You don't get a real dynamic flex pattern. In fact, it's a dead flex pattern. It just bends and it comes back. And depending on the thickness of the foil of the plastic, it might bend real slow, and it'll come back slowly. A little thicker fin would be a little bit more rigid, but it still kind of has the same flex pattern. And at first, some of the surfers got sponsored, and they tried them, but they ended up going back to Glassons, because at that time, fiberglass layup, that material that the fins were made out of, had a more dynamic flex pattern. In the base would be thicker, so it was a little bit more rigid, and the tip would be a lot thinner, so it would swim and flex and depending on the thickness. And so So the pros got sponsored, and they had in theory they had the boxes with the plastic fins, but they were all getting glass fins made. In the early 70s, I've mentioned this before, I was working alongside Skip Fry at J&S, and Skip was a fin maniac or whatever. He always had a box of about 10 or 12 or 15 fins in his car, and at first I was tripping. But there's bigger fins, there's smaller fins, there's fins with more rake, less rake, there's fins with thicker bases, thinner bases, and so forth. So I started, and I noticed that he would have special fin sheets made up out of 4-ounce layup, which is, I don't know, you get roughly 25% more layers. They're thinner layers, and you could get a much cleaner foil out of it, and you get much more dynamic flex. And then I took it a step further, and a friend of mine worked at Ridout Plastics, and I got some G10, which is a 5/8 inch sheet would be, I don't know, 60 layers. A 4-ounce sheet would be 35, 40 layers, and 6-ounce or even 8-ounce sheet would be under 20. But the G10, was upwards of 60, I don't know, maybe more layers, and it was epoxy. And those fins are beautiful. I mean, I have fins that are 15, 20 years old that are made out of G10, and they haven't, their flex hasn't changed a bit. They're holding up, and I've got a few friends that I turned on to G10 fins, and they said they can't believe how good they still work after 10 years. So back to the fin box thing, people became disillusioned with fins, and I tried to get fiberglass fins made to fit the FCS boxes, and all the fin makers were afraid to, because they were threatened. I shouldn't say who, but whatever. They were threatened by FCS, litigation, because they needed to have proprietary fins go with proprietary boxes. But more and more surfers started finding fin makers to make glass fins. And finally, FCS caved in, and Futures came online, and there was a few other pretty good fin companies that you can control the fin angles and the cant, but it really, in the business world, there seems like there's always two main players battling each other, and FCS started making composite fins, but FCS started making composite fins, and they were insane. They were lighter. The composites were much lighter than the plastic, and they were more rigid, so they could have better control over the flex. Some of the fins had a real rigid snap back, and others had kind of a slower snap back, and Futures followed in right behind them, and Futures did an even better job with composites. And so the two battled, and they have great fins these days. It's like, I use the analogy of you got a nice car. Why the heck would you put crummy semi-bowl tires on the car? It's another expense, but you can keep the fins. You can, when you sell your board, you sell it without fins, or you hang onto the plastic fins that still come with some boards. But friends don't let friends ride plastic fins. Trust me, if you've never, if your skills are starting to come along and all you've been riding is plastic fins, the first time you ride a composite fin, you're going to freak. And so that goes back to the question, what's the difference between Glassons and box fins? With a Glasson, you're stuck with that template, with that amount of rake, with that amount of area in the foil. Whereas with a box, you can explore. I have friends that I've been for the last 15 plus years been a huge fan of quads, and I encourage my friends to get, it's kind of tough to get them to just go straight quad, but I can talk them into a 5-fin board because they can ride it as a tri-fin. And I've had friends that have ridden their boards only as tri-fins for a year. And I say, you haven't tried it as a quad? And they go, no. I go, just don't leave the 5th fin in the middle, but put the 2 trailing fins behind the front fins. And more often than not, they come back to me and go, oh my God, the board's a different board. And you're going to find, quads aren't for everybody, but for the average surfer, they drop in easier because the way the drag works, tri-fin wants to go perpendicular to the wave energy, and a quad wants to run parallel with the wave energy. And so you can take off later, you can turn earlier on a steeper wave, you can hold a higher line, and the turns, the first time I rode a modern quad, I made them back in the early 80s, but the first time I rode a modern quad was 2004, 2005, and the first cutback I did, I fucking freaked because the thing, I was getting ready for it to kind of slow down a little bit like a tri-fin does, and then getting ready to bank off the oncoming whatever's, wave. And the board held its speed. In fact, it almost felt like it accelerated as it came back around, and it held its speed so insanely. I almost fell off, and the rest of the session, that's all I wanted to do was cutbacks and get used to the feeling, and but that's my preference. There's definitely a place for tri-fins, but I think for the average surfer, you would be better off with quads, and you get one set of composites with a board, and then as time goes by, maybe get another set, or maybe get smaller trailer fins or bigger front fins, and all of those things are going to really, really affect the way your board rides. So yeah, don't use shitty plastic tires.
Pick a fresh, just that team. Second is good.
E-poly versus full epoxy for a short board.
EPS.
Yeah. E-poly is the polyurethane core glass with epoxy, and then EPS is expanded polystyrene and an epoxy glass job. You have to glass the EPS with epoxy. If you use polystyrene, it'll melt the foam. Polyurethane, you can use both resins. And just for starters, I think epoxy resin is the future. It's who uses in the outside world who uses polyester resin anymore. The epoxy resin is just, and it's been developed for surfboards in the last 10, 15 years. And at first it was kind of, because boats used it and they built it, furniture, whatever, with epoxy. It didn't matter if it ended up turning yellow over time, because it wasn't really a bright enough yellow to affect the aesthetics of those projects. But surfboards, yeah, we started, in 2005 when Clark foam closed. We had no foam. We experimented. We tried foam from a couple of brands from Australia. We had Brazilian foam. We had South African foam and foam from a few other places, and it really varied in quality. And that made me understand why as time went by, a lot of the pros really liked the boards made out of Australian foam and Brazilian foam, because it was better than Clark. I thought Clark was the best, but Clark has evolved. It's not called Clark anymore. It's called US Blanks. But the difference between E-poly and EPS is primarily the core, really. It's the EPS core averages around a 2-pound density, but you can get it 1.7, you can get it 1.5. I make guns occasionally out of 3-pound density EPS foam, which is very strong. And you can get different weights of PU, but you really surrender a lot of strength as you go lighter and lighter in PU. And in order to get a light PU board, you're going to have to compromise. It's going to get dense and eventually footwells. And some people are okay with that because they realize 1 pound in weight, a 7-pound 6-foot board versus a 6-pound, was it 12% or something lighter? But it's a world of difference in performance. It's just lighter, easier to throw around. It's less glass, so it's flexier. Probably won't hold its flex life as long as a little bit heavier glass job. And but the epoxy resin is so much greener than polyester, and the polyurethane foam, it could be better in terms of the green tag. The EPS foam, I did some research the other day. I thought I kind of had it down between polyurethane and EPS and extruded styrene, which is a completely different thing. It's pretty much water resistant, but as it turns out, the XTR foam is a little less green than the EPS. So EPS boards are, as I mentioned earlier, they run a good 10% lighter with heavier cloth. We'll go 6.4 on top and 6 ounce bottom, and the board will come out lighter than all 4 ounce glass PU board. And the EPS, I think it works great in small ways because, partially because of the weight, but partially because of the characteristics of the ride. It's just you have basically less material between the top and the bottom surface. And so it transmits the energy different. The board, some people describe it as twitchy, nervous, but in small crappy surf, I think that sensitivity is a big plus. And more and more pros these days have a couple of EPS boards in their quivers. I think a lot of them have e-poly boards in their quivers, and it's just a matter of time actually before polyester resin will be very, very strictly controlled. And we're making the move slowly, but we're making the move towards more and more of our boards being glassed with epoxy. And so I hope that at least partially answered your question. What's my preference? Shortboard EPS for sure. And as you get into bigger boards, weight isn't such as big of a deal as it is in the shortboards. In fact, as you get into boards for bigger surf or longer, you actually want them a little bit heavier. So, what else have we got here? What should I look for on a step up? That's a good question. Most people start out with their first board. That's their only board, and that's the board they ride on the weekends, or if they're lucky, they get to surf more often. And then usually their next board, they try to step it down in size. I'll briefly go into that. Beginning surfers think, well, I've been riding a 9-foot foamy. I'm ready for my 6'2" board now because I can stand up and everybody has to learn, but I can angle now, so I'm ready for a little short board. No. I suggest not taking it any more than 6 inches at a time as you work your way down, because it'll take you a while to adjust just to that 6 inches. But on a step-up board, eventually that should be your second board to quiver. You have your performance shortboard or your everyday shortboard, and then if you're into riding a little bit bigger surf, you get a step up, and generally speaking, that's a board that's 2 to 4 inches longer than what you ride as a shortboard. And we have the Slayer, which is actually a step down board. It's designed primarily for slabbier type waves, and wide points fuller, a little farther forward, the nose a little bit fuller, and there's a longer line between the midsection and the tail. And there's a little bit less nose rocker, and there's a little bit more tail rocker. But people like the Slayer, but they wanted to make it a little bit looser, so we did the Slayer 2. And back, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, we had next one up, step-up board, and that was designed to be ridden 2 to 4, maybe 6 inches longer. But I really like the Blackbird. It's got modern sensibilities in terms of tempo proportion. The nose is a touch fuller. It has a little bit lower nose rocker than the boards did 5-10 years ago. And it has plenty of tail rocker in it. I build Blackbirds all the way up to 9 foot, but it's it's basically the template proportions and the rocker. But yeah, I'd say if you're a beginning to intermediate surfer, have your step up be a little bit longer, maybe 6 or 8 inches longer than your regular board, just so you start to develop confidence and paddling in, catching waves, getting out of the way of waves, still being able to duck dive and handle it. So yeah, if you're early in your surfing career, you don't get to surf that much, but you want to surf bigger waves, step up can mean a board 6 inches, 8 inches, 10 inches longer. But for a more advanced surfer, Wade Carmichael, his go-to shortboard is 5'11" or 6'0", and his step-up board is 6'1". All right. But he makes that 6'1" work in pretty big surf. And the differences are as the board gets a little bit more pulled into nose and tail, and the middle width stays roughly the same, maybe down 1/8 of an inch. The nose and tail maybe drop a 1/2 inch, maybe even 3/4 of an inch in width. And but that's if you're not into riding bigger waves, your second board might be a Fish or a Dort or something like that. But step up's a great second or third board to your quiver. What are the different functionalities for the different tails? Squash, swallow, diamond, thumb, round pin. And I mentioned Dave Barr and his fin deal is called Shapeshifter, where he has basically a lot of boards are roughly the same width in the tail, except for the last 8 to 6 inches. And if you have a straighter outline, you're going to get more drive, more distance out of your turns. You look at fishes and how straight they are, and they're really wide swallowtails. They stay flat on the water, no matter how good the surfer is. He cannot. It's very difficult to roll those wide-tailed fishes up on a rail. You can pull the tail in a little bit on a swallowtail, and it'll still have a feeling of a longer little bit longer line and a little bit better bite than, say, a squash tail. Because a square tail carries the area back, and it has the extra little bit of volume between the corners, and it will ride very pivoty as well. But then when you start to round the corners off, and it becomes a squash tail, then that loosens the board up a little bit. You still have most of the boards, short boards, they have a hip or a wing, very subtle hip, but that hip is a breaking point in your outline, and the last few inches of the board, as it starts to pull in squash tail, it has a little bit tighter arc that you start your turn in, you break your line, you come up the face. You have a rounded squash, it's just all relative. You work your way down to a round tail, and as I mentioned before, like the average is 6 inches up is around 11 inches, give or take. And even a round tail, although it has a lot less area in the last 6 inches, is pretty much around 11 inches wide, maybe 10, 7/8 or something on an average shortboard. And I repeat this on a pretty often basis, that you say, well, what does this do on the surf? What does this design aspect do for a surfboard? And my answer back is, imagine your question, but you've taken it to an extreme. How's a board with a 14-inch tail block going to ride versus a board that's a round pin? You take your concept, your question, and you go to extremes on either side, and really that's a lot of what a surfboard shaper works on, is finding a balance. A balance in all the aspects of the surfboard design, the outline, the rocker, the foil. So we had a question about foils. How do they do? What are they? And you imagine a board very, very thick in the nose and very thin in the tail. It's going to have a lot of forward momentum because the mass is all forward and the volume is forward. And Shane Horan used to ride boards with incredibly thick. I made him some boards for a year or two, and I used to get a 7.4 Brewer from Clark Foam, and I'd make him a 6.2 Zap. And the reason I did that is because he wanted his tail so thick. And you look back at Shane's style, probably a lot of you don't even remember who Shane is, but he was a great surfer, but he drew really different lines. He stood on the tail, and he very, very rarely ventured from the tail block because his noses were so proportionally narrow, and the thickness was so far back on the board. He'd pretty much plant himself on the tail and do all of his turning from there. I try to make as many models as I have. I still try to keep them all fairly balanced. We measure the thickness primarily at 1 foot back from the nose and 1 foot up from the tail. And back in the days before I had, the computer, I used to measure it thickness 18 inches for both ends and 24 inches. But these days I try to keep it like average nose thickness might be 1.45, and the average tail thickness would be 1.5. Maybe 500th of an inch. 500th of an inch difference. Maybe a 1/10 of an inch difference. But I really. Some of our models have, tails that might be 1.6 and the nose might be 1.4, but generally I like to keep it within a 1/10 of an inch. either way, depending on what the board's designed for. A front foot surfer, somebody likes to drive off their front foot, I'll shift the volume up a little bit more. Somebody likes to stay on the tail and turn in the pocket a lot, I'll move that thickness back. What else? What else do you have there?
Best selling model of rest of all time.
That's our best-selling model. Well, I mean, back in the day, I never really used to do models. I used to go guns or semi-guns or hot dog boards or fishy boards. You know, but as time went by, I realized the importance of a particular model. And the Prana, and I think partially because of its unique look, the Prana had three wings with a narrower swallowtail and a semi-fold front, but it had thinner, high-performance rails. And I'd say hands down for several years, the Prana was the best seller. And then for quite a while, the Dort. The Dort still is one of our best sellers. We tried to make a thinner Dort, like a T-Dort or a Dort 2, which is a full squash tail. And people ordered them, but the Dort, hands down, is, kind of a monster model, for about the last 5 or 8 years. But in the last couple of years, we've had the SD is very, very popular. The M8 is kind of popular. The Blackbird is, we get quite a few orders for those. So I'd say maybe the Dort still has a slight edge, but the SD and what else? Get a lot of orders for.
Yeah, as a groveler, that is the Dort.
The Dort, yeah. The Dort is a small wakeboard as a groveler. I've told the story, but it was originally a fish sitting in the outgoing rack waiting to get glassed, and somebody bumped it over and knocked one of the swallowtails off. So Rick Hammond, who I personally think is one of the best shavers in the world, he took it and he put a double wing round tail on it. And we glassed it, and we weren't sure how it was going to ride. And the first person that rode it came back freaking. And so I made a few more, same response. And the Dort, it's got the low rocker, it's got the fuller rails, it's got the, but the tail breaks down with a couple of wings, which makes all the difference between that and a regular fish. Like I said, with a straighter line on a regular fish, the board's going to draw, and it's also going to want to stay flatter on the water. The thing with the Dort is, because the tail pulls in and it has a couple of break points in the outline, it's a much looser fish board.
This one is good. Blade with channels or no channels? Everyday California waves.
Well, the blade with no channels is a pretty deep concave, like 0.28, almost 0.3, just behind the wide point, center point, and it maintains that depth most of the way out through the tail. And that I think that would be a better board for maybe a little bit smaller everyday surf. A blade with channels has a little bit lower tail rocker and slightly lower nose rocker, and it has less lateral break. In other words, the concave is like 0.08, maybe 0.1, and once again it's the deepest behind center, and then it zeroes out into a very slight V in the fin area, and then there's the channels. So my thinking on that is the channel bottom is a little bit dry of your board. You get a little bit more distance out of your turns. And the concave blade has a little bit tighter arcs. What else have we got?
We've got 10 more minutes, only 9 minutes.
Hang in there with me for a second. Mid-lengths. That's a good topic. Mid-lengths seem to be rising in popularity in the last year. A refocus back on fun surfing and not all about scoring points, etc. Would you ever consider adding a mid-length option to your collection of boards? Is there something from your back catalog that you could re-release and tweak? Well, me being a bigger guy, I've always had bigger boards in my quiver, and I've always made like a big fish or a Yeti, which is a big full board for a big guy. But and I've been making eggs since the beginning of my shaping career. But I recently got an order. I made a board, or actually Rick made it for Zach up at Del Mar. It had a kind of almost an egg nose, 16 and a half inches, and it had a kind of a semi-full squash tail. And I looked at it, I go, man, that thing would look great with a thumbtail on it, a round tail thumbtail. And I sent a screenshot to. I posted it on Instagram, and the next day I got a call from Taylor Pye at Huntington Surfboard. He goes, "Dude, I want to order 6 of those things. Can you have them ready for me?" And so it's I'm going to call it the egg because it's exactly what I used to make, and that's what it looks like to me as an egg. But it's a modern update. It's got a little bit more modern rocker. The entry's pretty relaxed, but it's got a little bit more tail rocker, and the bottom is a slight release up in the nose, pretty flat in the middle, maybe a touch of release on the rails, and then into a V that's 0.15, 0.18 deep, about 24 inches up. And I kind of, some of the boards I leave flat paddle V, some I have with a very slight very shallow double concave. And I'm offering them up twin fins, 2+1 with a bigger box in the middle, or a regular tri-fin. And everybody's so psyched on it. I'll probably get a few more shop orders here in the next few weeks. And Australia is very keen. But yeah, it's that, once again, that could be what could be your main board, or it could be your second board when the surf's just small. It's 2 foot, maybe with some 3 foot sets, and maybe when it's a little bit more lined up but it's crumbly or whatever, a mid-length board is a blast. It's fun. You're not worried about scoring points. You're not worried about doing errors. You're learning to draw different, cleaner, longer lines. But you can still do fairly tight cutbacks on them, and do off the lips and floaters and things like that. But no, they're everybody, Australia's all abuzz about it now. We're all abuzz about it here, and I've got boards you can kind of consider mid-length. I've had in the line for years, like the Moby Fish, the Zeppelin, the Yeti. But we're gonna have as I said, I do mostly custom order business these days, but there's a few shops that are all over the new version of the egg. That's about it for me. I'm getting the signal from my co-pilot here. I'm blaming it on him. Anyways, thanks for tuning in, and everybody have a great week, and I'll be online next Tuesday evening. Take care.